The gunshot outside the Dusty Rose Saloon made Julia Freeman's voice waver for just a heartbeat before she recovered, her soprano cutting through the smoky air like a blade through butter as miners and cowboys alike forgot their card games to watch her perform. It was July 1878 in Cody, Wyoming, and the railroad had brought prosperity and chaos in equal measure to the small town nestled in the valley beneath the mountains. Julia had arrived 3 weeks earlier on that same railroad, her trunk filled with stage dresses and her heart filled with dreams that had shattered somewhere between Chicago and this dusty frontier town. The Opera House she'd been promised turned out to be nothing more than a lie told by a smooth-talking promoter who disappeared with her savings the moment they'd stepped off the train. Now she sang 6 nights a week at the Dusty Rose, dodging wandering hands and deflecting marriage proposals from men who'd been out on the range too long. The saloon owner, a portly man named Clarence, paid her enough to afford a room at the boarding house and little else. But she sang because it was the only thing she knew how to do, the only thing that had ever made sense in a world that seemed determined to knock her down. "That was beautiful, Miss Freeman," said an old-timer at the bar as she finished her set. She smiled politely and made her way toward the back room where she kept her shawl. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of spilled beer. Her throat ached from singing over the noise. She was reaching for her wrap when a voice behind her made her turn. "Excuse me, miss." The man was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with sandy hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of a summer sky. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously, and there was something different about him from the usual patrons. He wore clean clothes, for one thing, and his face was sun-weathered but kind. "I don't mean to intrude," he said quickly, seeing her guarded expression. "My name is Samuel Foster. I own a ranch about 5 miles north of town. I've been coming in to hear you sing for the past week, and well, I wanted to talk to you about something." Julia wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, her defenses up. "If this is a proposal, Mr. Foster, I'm afraid I'll have to decline. I get about 3 of those a night." A flush crept up his neck. "No, madam, nothing like that. It's just, well, I couldn't help but notice that you seem like you deserve better than this place. The smoke can't be good for your voice, and the men here don't appreciate real talent when they hear it." "I appreciate your concern, but I need the work." She moved to step past him, but he shifted, not blocking her way but clearly hoping she'd hear him out. "I have a proposition," Samuel said. "A business proposition. I've got a big porch on my ranch house, faces west toward the mountains. Most beautiful view in Wyoming, if I do say so myself. I was thinking, what if you sang there instead? I could build you a proper stage, get some benches set up. Folks could come out from town, bring their families. It'd be respectable, wholesome entertainment." Julia stared at him. "You want me to sing on your porch? I know it sounds strange," he admitted, "but hear me out. You could charge admission, keep every penny. I wouldn't take a cent. I've got the land and I've got the lumber. I could have something built in a week. You could sing in the fresh air under the stars. No smoke, no drunks trying to grab at you, just music." "Why would you do this?" Julia asked suspiciously. "What's in it for you?" Samuel met her eyes steadily. "Honestly, my ranch is doing well. I've got good cattle, good water, good grazing land. But it's lonely out there, and I miss hearing music. My mother used to sing before she passed. And when I hear you, it reminds me that there's beauty in the world, not just hard work and solitude. I figure if I build you a stage, you'll sing, and I'll get to hear it. Seems like we'd both benefit." She wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, another scheme by another man who wanted something from her. But there was sincerity in his face, and more than that, there was kindness. She'd learned to recognize the difference between men who saw her as prey and men who simply saw her as a person. "Let me think about it," she said finally. "Fair enough." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "This is how to get to my ranch. If you want to come see the place before you decide, you're welcome anytime. I'm there most days working. If I'm out on the range, my housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, will be there. She's a good woman, and she'll make sure you're treated proper." Julia took the paper, and Samuel put his hat back on, tipping it to her before heading back into the main room of the saloon. She watched him go, noting how he moved through the crowd without swagger or aggression, just a quiet confidence. That night, lying in her narrow bed at the boarding house, Julia thought about the offer. It was unusual, certainly, but no more unusual than anything else that had happened to her since she'd left Chicago. She'd come west chasing a dream that had turned into a nightmare, and now here was a stranger offering her a stage on his porch. It was absurd. It was possibly wonderful. The next morning she asked around town about Samuel Foster. The general store owner spoke highly of him. "Sam Foster. Good man. His father built that ranch from nothing, and Sam's kept it going since his folks passed. He's honest, pays his bills on time, treats his workers fair. Bit of a loner, but that's not unusual out here. Why do you ask?" "He made me a business offer," Julia said carefully. The store owner raised his eyebrows. "Well, I'd trust Sam Foster's word over just about anyone else in this territory. If he said he'd do something, he'll do it." Julia spent the day considering. She had a performance that evening at the Dusty Rose, and as she sang through the smoke and noise, she imagined what it might be like to perform under open sky, with mountains as her backdrop instead of stained wallpaper and dim oil lamps. After her set, Clarence called her into his office. He was sweating despite the cool evening, and his eyes didn't quite meet hers. "Julia, I need to talk to you about your wages," he said. Her stomach dropped. "What about them? Business has been slow." "I'm going to have to cut your pay by half starting next week." "Slow? The place is packed every night I sing," Clarence shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "That's my offer. Take it or leave it." Julia felt anger rise in her chest, hot and bitter. She knew what this was about. She'd rejected his advances 2 weeks ago, and this was his petty revenge. She could argue, could plead, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Men like Clarence always found a way to punish women who said no. "I quit," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. His face went red. "You can't quit. You're under contract. A contract that you just broke by changing my wages. I believe that voids the agreement, doesn't it?" She'd learned a few things about contracts during her brief time working in Chicago's theaters. She walked out of his office with her head high, even as her heart raced with fear. She had maybe 2 weeks of savings, enough for rent and food if she was careful. She just gambled everything on the word of a cowboy she'd met once. The next morning, she hired a wagon and driver to take her out to the Foster Ranch. The road wound through grassland that stretched endlessly, dotted with cattle and occasional stands of cottonwood trees. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. The ranch house came into view as they crested a hill. It was a substantial building, 2 stories with a wide porch wrapping around the front and side. It was painted white, which was unusual out here, and there were flower boxes under the windows, though the flowers had clearly been neglected. Beyond the house were a large barn, several outbuildings, and an extensive system of corrals and paddocks. Samuel was working near the barn when the wagon pulled up. He set down his tools and walked over, wiping his hands on his pants. "Miss Freeman," he said, and she could hear the pleasure in his voice. "You came." "I wanted to see the place before I decided," she said, stepping down from the wagon. She paid the driver and asked him to return in 2 hours. "Would you like the tour?" Samuel asked. She followed him around the property. He showed her the livestock, explaining his breeding program for cattle and horses with enthusiasm that made his whole face light up. He introduced her to his 3 ranch hands, all of them respectful and polite. He showed her the bunkhouse where they stayed, the cookhouse, the barn with its neat rows of stalls and sweet smell of hay. Then he brought her to the house. The porch was even more impressive up close, with sturdy posts and a roof that would provide shade in summer. The view was exactly as he described. Miles of grassland rolling toward mountains that looked purple in the afternoon light. "I was thinking we could build the stage right here," Samuel said, indicating a spot at the corner where the porch wrapped around. "It's the flattest part and the acoustics should be good. Sound would carry out across the yard. We could set up benches in rows, maybe 50 or 60 people could fit comfortably." "You've really thought about this," Julia said. "I don't make offers I haven't thought through." He paused. "Would you like to meet Mrs. Chen? She's been my housekeeper since my mother passed 3 years ago. She keeps the house running while I work the ranch." Mrs. Chen turned out to be a woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes and capable hands. She was one of the few Chinese immigrants in the area, and Julia later learned that Samuel had hired her when other ranchers wouldn't, after her husband had died in a mining accident. Mrs. Chen served them tea in the parlor, and Julia noticed that the house was clean but sparse, decorated with a woman's touch that had clearly faded over time. "So you're the singer," Mrs. Chen said, studying Julia with frank curiosity. "Mr. Foster talks about you all the time." Samuel looked embarrassed. "I mentioned Miss Freeman's talent a few times." "Every day for a week," Mrs. Chen said dryly. "He said your voice could make angels weep." "Mrs. Chen," Samuel protested, but Julia found herself smiling. There was something endearing about his embarrassment, about the whole situation. Here was a successful rancher, a man who commanded respect and ran a substantial operation, blushing like a schoolboy because his housekeeper revealed he'd been praising her singing. "Tell me truly," Julia said to Mrs. Chen, "is your employer an honest man?" "The most honest I've ever known," Mrs. Chen replied without hesitation. "He says he'll do something, it gets done. He treats people fair, doesn't matter their background. When he says this is just about music and business, I believe him." Julia sipped her tea and thought. The house felt solid, safe. The land was beautiful. And Samuel Foster, strange as this whole proposition was, seemed genuine. "I'll do it," she said, "on one condition. I want a written contract that specifies I keep all admission fees and that I'm free to leave any time I choose. No obligations beyond the performances themselves." "Absolutely," Samuel said immediately. "I'll have the lawyer in town draw something up. Anything else?" "How long will it take you to build this stage?" he considered. "With my men helping, and if we work hard, I'd say 5 days. Then I'll start performing a week from Saturday. That gives you time to build and me time to spread word in town." They shook hands on it, and Julia felt the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. This was a man who worked with his hands, who built things. She decided to trust that he'd build what he promised. True to his word, Samuel had the contract ready 3 days later. Julia read it carefully, and it was exactly as they'd discussed. Simple, clear, and completely in her favor. She signed it, and he signed it, and the lawyer notarized it. Meanwhile, Samuel and his men worked on the stage. Julia rode out on the 4th day to check progress, and found them putting finishing touches on a platform that was sturdy and level, with decorative railings and steps leading up to it. They'd built benches in neat rows, enough seating for at least 70 people. There was even a small structure at the back of the stage that would serve as a changing area. "It's beautiful," Julia said, genuinely moved. "You built all this in 4 days. Had good motivation," Samuel said. He was sweaty from work, sawdust in his hair, and he looked happy in a way she hadn't seen before. We all did. The boys are excited about having regular entertainment out here. Gets lonely on a ranch. Julia spent the following days in town, spreading word about her new venue. She made simple flyers and posted them at the general store, the church, the post office. The response was surprising. Women especially seemed excited about the prospect of entertainment that wasn't in a saloon, somewhere they could bring their children. The morning of her first performance, Julia woke with butterflies in her stomach. She dressed in her best performance gown, a deep blue silk that her mother had made for her before she'd left Chicago. Mrs. Chen had offered to help her prepare, and Julia accepted, grateful for the company. At the ranch, Mrs. Chen helped her get ready in the main house. They did her hair, and Mrs. Chen proved surprisingly skilled with cosmetics. "I worked in a theater in San Francisco before I came here," Mrs. Chen explained. "Did costumes and makeup. That was a long time ago. Why did you leave?" Mrs. Chen's face grew sad. "My husband wanted to try mining, said we'd strike it rich. We didn't, and then he died in a collapse. Mr. Foster's father knew my husband, respected him. When Mr. Foster Sr. passed and Samuel took over, he kept me on. Samuel's a good man, Miss Freeman." "Lonely, but good. You think he's lonely? I know he is. He works from dawn until dark, and he's good at what he does. But this ranch, it's not enough to fill a life. He needs family, friendship, love. He won't admit it, but he does." Julia thought about this as she finished preparing. She'd been so focused on her own survival, her own dreams, that she hadn't really considered what Samuel might be seeking beyond just hearing music. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe they both were. As the sun began to lower toward the mountains, wagons started arriving. Families came from town, from neighboring ranches. They brought picnic baskets and blankets. Children ran around the yard while adults claimed seats on the benches. Samuel had set up oil lamps that would provide light as dusk fell, and the whole scene had a festive air. Julia watched from inside the house, her heart pounding. This was different from the saloon. These were families, respectable people who'd made the journey specifically to hear her sing. What if she disappointed them? "You'll be wonderful," Mrs. Chen said, reading her anxiety. "Just sing like you did at the saloon, but without having to compete with drunks and noise. This is your chance to really be heard." Samuel came to the house as the sun touched the mountain peaks. He'd cleaned up, wearing a fresh shirt and vest, his hair neatly combed. "There's about 80 people out there," he said. "I think we're going to need more benches for next time. Are you ready?" "I'm terrified," Julia admitted. He smiled. "I've seen you perform in front of rough cowboys and miners without flinching. Why are you scared of families?" "Because they matter more," she said. "The men at the saloon, they just wanted noise and distraction. These people came to really listen. What if I'm not good enough?" Samuel looked at her intently. "Miss Freeman, Julia, you're more than good enough. You're extraordinary. And these people are going to realize what I already know, that you're a true artist and we're lucky to hear you." His confidence bolstered her. She took a deep breath, nodded, and let him escort her out to the stage. The crowd applauded as she appeared, and Julia felt a rush of warmth toward these strangers who'd come to give her a chance. She stepped onto the stage Samuel had built and looked out at the sea of faces, at the mountains beyond, at the sky turning gold and pink with sunset. She began to sing. Her first song was a traditional ballad, something familiar and beloved. Her voice rang out clear and strong in the open air, carrying across the yard and into the grasslands beyond. Children stopped playing to listen. Adults leaned forward, captivated. And Julia felt something she hadn't felt in months, pure joy in her craft. She sang songs of love and loss, of home and wandering, of hope and heartbreak. She sang the repertoire she'd performed 1,000 times, but it felt new under the open sky. Between songs, she talked to the audience, told them the stories behind the music. They laughed at her jokes and wiped tears during the sad ballads. Samuel stood at the back, leaning against a fence post, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Even from a distance, she could feel his attention, and it made her sing better, reach deeper for emotion and truth in every note. When she finished her final song, the applause was thunderous. People stood, cheering. Children ran up to the stage asking for her autograph, which she gave with a bemused smile. Women thanked her for bringing beauty to their hard lives. Men praised her talent with respectful admiration. As the crowd dispersed, families loading into wagons for the journey back to town, Julia helped Mrs. Chen collect the admission fees. They'd charged 50 cents a person, and when they counted the money, Julia stared at the pile of coins in disbelief. $40, she said. I made $40 in one night. You earned it, Mrs. Chen said firmly. And Mr. Foster says they'll come back. He's already planning how to expand the seating for next week. Samuel approached as Julia was packing up. That was incredible, he said. Even better than I imagined. What did you think? I think you gave me back something I'd lost, Julia said honestly. At the saloon, I was just background noise. Tonight, I felt like an artist again. Thank you for this, Samuel, truly. He ducked his head, pleased. It's me who should thank you. You made my ranch feel alive tonight. It hasn't felt that way since my parents passed. Over the following weeks, the Saturday performances became a tradition. Word spread beyond Cody, and people traveled from as far as 50 miles away to hear Julia Freeman sing on Samuel Foster's porch. He built more benches, then more, until the yard could accommodate over 100 people. Julia's earnings grew, and for the first time since coming west, she felt financially secure. But something else was growing too, though Julia tried to ignore it at first. She found herself thinking about Samuel during the week, wondering what he was doing on the range. When she arrived at the ranch on Saturdays, her heart would lift at the sight of him. They began having dinner together before performances, just the two of them and Mrs. Chen, talking about everything and nothing. She learned about his childhood, about his dreams for the ranch, about the loneliness he rarely acknowledged. He learned about her too. About her mother who'd encouraged her singing, her father who disapproved, her determination to make something of herself despite every obstacle. About the betrayal that had brought her west and the resilience that had kept her going. One Saturday in September, Samuel asked if she'd like to go riding before the performance. Julia had never been on a horse, and the admission made him laugh with delight. A woman who can command a stage but has never ridden. We have to fix that immediately. He saddled a gentle mare named Daisy and helped Julia mount. His hands were steady on her waist, and she felt heat rise to her face at his touch. He led her around the paddock at first, then out into the grassland, walking beside her and offering encouragement. "You're a natural," he said as she began to relax into the horse's rhythm. "Daisy likes you. How can you tell? Her ears are relaxed, and she's not fighting the bit. She trusts you." They rode out to a small creek where cottonwood trees provided shade. Samuel helped her dismount, and they sat by the water, watching it burble over smooth stones. "I've been wanting to ask you something," Samuel said, picking up a pebble and tossing it into the creek. "These performances, the stage, all of it, are you happy with how things are going?" "More than happy. Samuel, you changed my life. I'm earning good money, I'm doing what I love, and I'm being treated with respect. That's more than I ever had in Chicago. Good. I'm glad." He hesitated. "I've been thinking, and please tell me if this is overstepping, but have you thought about what happens when winter comes? Wyoming winters are brutal. You can't perform outside in the snow. Julia had thought about this, though she'd been trying not to. I suppose I'll have to find something else for those months. Maybe I could go south, find work in Denver or Santa Fe. The thought of leaving made her chest ache in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. Or, Samuel said carefully, you could perform inside. The main room of my house is big enough. We could move the furniture, set up chairs. It wouldn't be as grand as the outdoor performances, but it would work. You could keep singing through the winter. You'd let me use your home like that. It's already transformed my life having these performances. Why stop just because of weather? He looked at her directly. Unless you want to leave, I'd understand if you did. You're talented enough to perform anywhere. I don't want to leave, Julia said, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. I like it here. I like the ranch, I like the people who come to listen, I like Mrs. Chen. She paused. I like you. Samuel's face lit up. I like you too, Julia, more than like, if I'm being honest. I know we haven't known each other long, just a couple of months, but I find myself looking forward to Saturdays all week. Not just for the music, but to see you, to talk to you. You make everything brighter. Julia's heart raced. Samuel, I can't afford to make mistakes. I've been hurt before by trusting the wrong person. I need to be careful. I understand. And I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just wanted you to know how I feel. We can take this as slow as you need. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the creek flow past. Julia thought about trust, about risk, about the difference between the men who'd hurt her and the man sitting beside her now. Samuel had never asked her for anything. He'd only given. He'd built her a stage, created opportunities, and asked nothing in return except the pleasure of her company. I'd like to try, she said finally. Taking things slow, seeing where this might go, but I need you to be patient with me. I can do patient, Samuel said, and the joy in his voice made her smile. They began courting, though that word seemed too formal for what developed between them. Samuel would come to town during the week to have lunch with her. She'd ride out to the ranch on Wednesday afternoons, and they'd explore the land together, him teaching her to ride better, showing her the places he loved. They talked for hours about everything. Books they'd read, dreams they harbored, fears they carried. The Saturday performances continued, and now Julia sang love songs with new depth, understanding the emotions in ways she hadn't before. The audience grew larger, and people began calling the Foster Ranch the Music Ranch. Samuel commissioned a proper sign for the entrance, carved wood that read Foster Ranch, home of Julia Freeman's Saturday concerts. In October, the first snow came early, dusting the mountains white. Samuel and his men prepared the main room of the house for indoor performances. They built a small raised platform at one end, installed better lighting, and created rows of seating that could be set up and taken down as needed. The first indoor concert was intimate and warm, with people crowded into the house, grateful to be out of the cold. After that performance, when the last guests had left and Mrs. Chen had gone to bed, Samuel and Julia sat in the kitchen drinking tea. The fire in the stove crackled softly. I've been thinking about the future, Samuel said. About what I want from life. And what do you want? Julia asked. I want this ranch to thrive, which it does. I want to build something lasting, which I'm doing. But mostly, I've realized I want someone to share it with. I don't want to come home to an empty house anymore. I want laughter and music and conversation. I want partnership. He reached across the table and took her hand. I'm falling in love with you, Julia. Maybe I already fell that first night I heard you sing at the saloon. I know it's fast, and I know you need time, but I wanted you to know where my heart is heading. Julia squeezed his hand, feeling tears prick her eyes. I'm falling too. It scares me how much I care about you, but Samuel, I'm not ready for marriage yet. I need to be sure to feel secure in who I am and what I've built. Can you understand that, of course? We'll take all the time you need." They continued through the winter in this way, growing closer with each passing week. Samuel never pushed, never demanded more than she was ready to give. He respected her independence, encouraged her music, and supported her dreams. In return, Julia found herself opening up in ways she never had before, trusting him with her fears and hopes. In December, a promoter from Denver came to one of her performances. Afterward, he offered her a contract to sing in his theater for 3 months in the spring. "It's a real opportunity," the promoter said. "You'd perform 6 nights a week, and I can pay you $100 a week. That's good money, Miss Freeman." Julia took his card and said she'd think about it. That night, lying awake in her room at the boarding house, she considered the offer. $100 a week was more than she'd ever dreamed of earning. It was security, prestige, everything she'd wanted when she left Chicago. But it would mean leaving Cody, leaving the ranch, leaving Samuel. She realized she couldn't imagine her life without him anymore. Somewhere along the way, in between the horseback rides and the long conversations and the quiet moments after performances, she'd stopped being afraid. She'd fallen completely in love. The next Saturday before her performance, she found Samuel in the barn checking on a pregnant mare. "The promoter from Denver offered me a job," she said. His face went carefully neutral. "That's wonderful, Julia. It's what you deserve, recognition from the wider world." I turned him down. Samuel looked up sharply. "What? Why?" "Because everything I want is already here. I don't need theaters in Denver or anywhere else. I have my stage, my audience, and most importantly, I have you." She took a breath. "Samuel Foster, I love you. I'm in love with you, and I don't want to be anywhere you're not." The joy that spread across his face was like sunrise. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the passion they'd been holding back for months. Julia kissed him back, feeling like she'd finally come home. "Marry me," he said when they broke apart. "Not because you need security or because I built you a stage. Marry me because we love each other and because life is better together than apart." "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married in February 1879, in a ceremony at the ranch with half the town in attendance. Julia wore a dress made by Mrs. Chen, who'd revealed unexpected talents with a needle. Samuel wore a new suit that he'd ordered from a tailor in Cheyenne, though he kept pulling at the collar nervously. The preacher conducted the ceremony on the same porch where Julia performed, and afterward, she sang for her guests, love songs that now carried the weight of real joy. Samuel stood beside her, holding her hand, and when she looked at him, she saw her entire future in his eyes. They settled into married life with surprising ease. Julia continued her Saturday performances, but now she was the lady of the ranch, helping Samuel with decisions and planning. She had opinions about the breeding program, about which cattle to sell and which to keep. He valued her input, treated her as a true partner. Mrs. Chen became more than a housekeeper. She became family. The 3 of them would have dinner together most nights, talking and laughing. Julia taught Mrs. Chen some of her songs, and sometimes they'd sing duets while Samuel pretended to complain about the noise, though he was clearly delighted. In the spring, Julia discovered she was pregnant. Samuel's reaction was pure elation. He immediately became overprotective, worrying about her health, insisting she rest more. She had to remind him that pregnancy wasn't an illness and that women had been having babies while working for thousands of years. "I know," he said, "but none of those women were carrying my child." That makes it different. She performed through her pregnancy, her expanding belly eventually visible to the audience. People loved it, seeing the lady of the ranch glowing with impending motherhood. In her 7th month, she finally agreed to stop performing and rest. Their son was born in October 1879, during the first snowfall of the season. They named him Thomas, after Samuel's father. He had his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, and from the moment he entered the world, he seemed determined to make his presence known with lusty cries. Samuel proved to be a devoted father, pacing the floor at night with a colicky baby, changing diapers without complaint, marveling at every tiny milestone. Julia would wake sometimes to find him standing over the cradle, just watching their son sleep with an expression of wonder on his face. "I never knew I could love something this much," he told her one night. "I thought I understood love when I married you, but this is something different. Looking at him, I'd do anything to keep him safe." "That's how I feel every time I look at both of you," Julia said, pulling him back to bed. "We made something beautiful, Samuel. We made a family." Julia resumed performing when Thomas was 3 months old, bringing him to the ranch on Saturdays in a basket. Mrs. Chen would watch him during performances, though sometimes his cries would provide unexpected accompaniment to her songs, making the audience laugh. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and songs, of ranch work and family life. Thomas grew into a curious, energetic boy who loved horses and music in equal measure. When he was 3, Julia became pregnant again, and in 1883 they welcomed a daughter they named Margaret, who came into the world with her mother's voice, crying in perfect pitch. The ranch prospered. Samuel's careful breeding program produced excellent cattle, and his reputation for honesty meant he got top prices at market. Julia's performances remained popular, evolving as her life did. She sang songs about motherhood, about the land, about the life they'd built. She also began teaching music to children in town, offering lessons twice a week. By 1885, they'd expanded the house, adding a music room for Julia and more bedrooms for their growing family. Samuel hired more ranch hands as the operation grew, and he built them a proper bunkhouse with individual rooms instead of just communal sleeping. One evening in early summer, they sat on the porch after a performance, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Thomas, now 6, was showing off his roping skills to some lingering audience members. Margaret, 2 years old, was sleeping in Julia's arms. "You ever miss it?" Samuel asked. "The opera houses, the grand theaters, the life you might have had if you'd stayed in Chicago or gone to Denver?" Julia considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like, but I don't miss it, not really. That life would have been lonely, always traveling, always performing for strangers. This is better. I sing for people I know, in a place I love, with a family that fills my heart. How could I miss something that would have meant giving all this up?" "I'm glad," Samuel said, "because I can't imagine my life without you. You turned a house into a home, a ranch into a community. You made everything matter more." "We did it together," Julia corrected. "You gave me a stage when I needed one most. You gave me safety when I'd been hurt. You gave me love when I'd stopped believing in it. We built this life together, Samuel, and it's more than I ever dreamed was possible." As the years continued to unfold, their life developed a beautiful complexity. Thomas proved to have his father's skill with animals and his mother's artistic sensibility. He'd spend mornings working alongside Samuel, learning the ranch, and afternoons with Julia, learning piano and developing a pleasant singing voice. By the time he was 10, he was performing duets with his mother at the Saturday concerts. Margaret was different, more spirited and independent. She had no patience for music lessons but loved being outdoors. She'd follow Samuel everywhere, demanding to be taught everything about ranching. By age 5, She could ride as well as some of the ranch hands, and she had opinions about every aspect of the operation. "She's going to run this place someday," Samuel said one evening, watching Margaret direct the ranch hands on where to position a new fence. "She's got the mind for it and the will." "And Thomas?" Julia asked. "Thomas has music in his soul like his mother." "He'll find his own path, and will support whatever he chooses." In 1888, when Julia was 31 and Samuel was 33, they welcomed another child, a son they named Robert. His arrival was unexpected but joyful, and he rounded out their family in ways they hadn't anticipated. Where Thomas was serious and Margaret was fierce, Robert was pure sunshine, always laughing, always finding joy in everything. The Saturday performances had become an institution in the region. People planned their weekends around them, and Julia's repertoire had expanded to include not just traditional songs but original compositions about life in Wyoming, about the land and the people who worked it. Some of her songs spread beyond the ranch, sung by travelers and cowboys across the territory. In 1890, Wyoming achieved statehood, and there was talk of building a proper opera house in Cody. Several investors approached Julia about becoming the resident performer, offering her substantial money and prestige. She and Samuel discussed it seriously. The children were older now. Thomas was 11, Margaret was 7, and Robert was 2. She could potentially take the opera house position and still maintain her life at the ranch. "What do you want to do?" Samuel asked. "Not what you think you should do or what would make others happy. What does your heart want?" Julia thought about the porch, about the mountains in the background, about singing for people who'd become friends and family over the years. She thought about the freedom to choose her own songs, her own schedule, to perform as much or as little as she wanted. "I want to keep doing what we're doing," she said. "Maybe occasionally perform in town for special events, but keep the Saturday concerts here. This is where I belong, Samuel, not in some opera house in town." He pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "Then that's what we'll do." They compromised by agreeing to occasional special performances in town for holidays and celebrations, but the heart of Julia's musical life remained the ranch. The Saturday concerts continued, now sometimes featuring Thomas on piano or guitar, adding new dimensions to the performances. As the children grew, they each developed their own relationships with music and the ranch. Thomas, at 15, announced he wanted to study music formally, perhaps attend a conservatory back east. Julia and Samuel supported his dream, though the thought of him leaving was difficult. "He'll come back," Samuel assured her. "This land gets in your blood. He'll want to see the world, learn what he can, but he'll come home." Margaret, at 11, had no interest in leaving. She spent every spare moment learning ranching from her father, absorbing everything he taught with fierce concentration. She had ideas about modernizing their operation, about improving irrigation and breeding programs. "She's smarter than I ever was at her age," Samuel said proudly. "Maybe smarter than I am now. This ranch will thrive under her management." Robert, at 6, was still figuring out his place, but his joy and enthusiasm made everyone around him happy. He loved both music and ranching, loved his siblings and parents, loved everything about his life with uncomplicated delight. One evening in 1893, after a particularly successful performance, Julia and Samuel walked out beyond the house to a hill where they could see the whole ranch spread below them. Lights glowed in the bunkhouse and the main house. Horses moved peacefully in the paddocks. The land stretched endlessly under a sky full of stars. 15 years, Julia said. 15 years since you came into the saloon and made that outrageous offer to build me a stage on your porch." "Best decision I ever made," Samuel said. though I'll admit I had ulterior motives even then. Oh, do tell. I was hoping you'd fall in love with me, he said with a smile. I'd been watching you sing for a week and I was already half in love myself. I figured if I could get you out here, away from that terrible saloon, maybe I'd have a chance. Julia laughed. You never told me that. I thought it was really just about the music. It was about the music, but it was also about you. I wanted to know you and I wanted you to have the life you deserved. Building the stage accomplished both goals. You're a sneaky man, Samuel Foster. I'm a man who knew what he wanted and went after it, though I got far more than I ever imagined. 3 amazing children, a life partner who makes me better, and 15 years of music that's enriched not just my life but this whole community. They stood together in the darkness, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder. Julia thought about the frightened, angry woman who'd arrived in Cody 15 years ago, broke and betrayed and desperate. That woman had been transformed by this land, this man, this life they'd built together. I love you, she said. Every day I love you more. Is that possible? Shouldn't it level off at some point? If it does, no one's told me, Samuel said. Because I feel the same way. Every morning I wake up grateful you're beside me. Every night I fall asleep thanking God you chose me. They walked back to the house hand in hand, their shadows long in the moonlight. Inside, they could hear the children getting ready for bed, Mrs. Chen supervising with gentle firmness. This was their life, built from a chance meeting and a generous offer, grown through trust and love and hard work. The years continued their gentle progression. Thomas left for the conservatory in Boston in 1895, and the house felt emptier without him. But he wrote long letters about his studies, about the music he was learning and creating. And true to Samuel's prediction, he came home every summer, bringing new songs and new ideas. Margaret took on more responsibility at the ranch, working alongside her father as a true partner. By 16, she was managing significant portions of the operation, and Samuel relied on her judgment increasingly. Ranch hands twice her age took her orders without question, because she'd proven herself capable and fair. Robert grew into a charming young man who could gentle the wildest horse and make the grumpiest person smile. He had a gift for bringing people together, for smoothing conflicts and building bridges. Samuel said he'd make a fine foreman someday, the kind of leader people wanted to follow. Julia's performances evolved with time. Her voice matured, deepening and gaining richness. She sang less often as she approached her 40s, perhaps twice a month instead of every Saturday, but each performance was an event people planned around. She also spent more time teaching, developing the next generation of musicians in the region. In 1898, when Julia was 41 and Samuel was 46, they sat on the porch on a quiet evening, just the two of them. The children were all occupied elsewhere. Thomas was in Boston. Margaret was at a cattle auction in Cheyenne with 2 of the ranch hands, and Robert was spending the night at a friend's ranch. We're getting older, Julia observed, noting the silver in Samuel's hair, the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they met. We are, he agreed. Does it bother you? No. I've earned these gray hairs and these lines. They represent a life well lived, love well given and received. I wouldn't trade them for anything. Samuel took her hand, his own hands weathered by years of ranch work. I've been thinking about the future, about what happens to all this when we're gone. That's morbid talk for a beautiful evening. Practical talk, he corrected gently. I want to make sure everything's in order. Thomas will have his music career, but he should have a stake in the ranch too. Margaret will run it, clearly, but Robert needs his place as well. And I want to make sure you're protected, no matter what. They talked through the evening about their plans, about the legacy they wanted to leave. It wasn't sad discussion, but rather satisfying, knowing they'd built something that would outlast them, that would provide for their children and grandchildren. The new century arrived with celebration and hope. Thomas, now 21, had graduated from the conservatory and was performing professionally, but he spent summers at the ranch, often bringing musician friends who'd perform with Julia. The Saturday concerts became more elaborate, featuring multiple performers and growing audiences. Margaret, 17, showed no interest in marriage despite numerous suitors. "I'll marry when I find someone who loves this land as much as I do and doesn't expect me to stop running it," she declared. Julia and Samuel exchanged glances, remembering their own courtship, and trusted she'd know when she found the right person. Robert, 12, was developing into a fine horseman and showing real talent for training difficult animals. He had patience and intuition that served him well. One evening in the summer of 1901, a young man named Daniel Wright came to the ranch with his father to look at purchasing some breeding stock. Daniel was Margaret's age, recently returned from agricultural school in the East. He and Margaret spent hours discussing cattle genetics and grazing rotation, and Julia noticed the way her daughter's face lit up when talking to someone who shared her passion. Over the following months, Daniel became a frequent visitor, always with some question about ranching that needed Margaret's expertise. Samuel watched the courtship with amusement. "He's doing what I did," Samuel told Julia. "Finding excuses to be around the woman he's falling for, hoping she'll notice him." "Will she? She already has. She's just making him work for it." He was right. By the end of summer, Daniel and Margaret were openly courting. They married in the spring of 1902, and Daniel moved to the ranch, working alongside Samuel and Margaret. He fit seamlessly into their operation, and Samuel finally had the additional help he needed to continue expanding. Thomas married that same year, a soprano he'd met in New York named Catherine. They settled in Boston but visited Wyoming regularly, and Catherine's voice blended beautifully with Julia's during their joint performances. In 1903, Margaret gave birth to Samuel and Julia's first grandchild, a girl they named Julia after her grandmother. Holding her tiny namesake, Julia felt the circle of life complete itself in the most satisfying way. She'd come west alone and desperate, and now she had a family that spread across the country, rooted in the land she'd grown to love. Samuel, now 50, decided to step back from day-to-day ranch management, turning primary operations over to Margaret and Daniel. He still worked, but at a slower pace, focusing on projects he enjoyed rather than necessity. He spent more time with Julia, the two of them taking long rides across the land, revisiting the places they'd courted all those years ago. "Are you happy?" Julia asked him one afternoon as they sat by the creek where he'd first told her he was falling in love with her. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Samuel said. "I have you. I have our children and now grandchildren. I have a ranch that's thriving under excellent management. What more could a man want?" "Nothing," Julia agreed. "We've been blessed beyond measure." The performances continued, though less frequently now. Julia sang on special occasions, holidays, celebrations, whenever the spirit moved her. Her voice had aged but remained beautiful, carrying weight and wisdom that only life experience could provide. Young singers from across the region came to study with her, and she shared everything she'd learned generously. In 1905, Robert, now 17, surprised everyone by announcing he wanted to join Thomas in the music business, not as a performer but as a manager and promoter. He'd been helping organize his mother's concerts for years and had a talent for bringing people together, for creating events that meant something to communities. "You've all found your paths," Julia told her children one evening when they were all home together. Thomas with his compositions and performances, Margaret with the ranch, Robert with building community through music. I'm so proud of all of you. We learned from the best, Margaret said. You and Father showed us how to work hard, love deeply, and build something meaningful. We're just following your example. The second decade of the new century brought changes. Mrs. Chen, now in her 70s, retired from housekeeping but remained on the ranch in a small cottage Samuel built for her. She spent her days gardening and spoiling her adopted grandchildren, as she considered the foster children to be. Julia and Samuel, both in their 50s, settled into a comfortable rhythm. They'd wake early, have coffee on the porch watching the sunrise, then spend their days on small projects and pleasures. Samuel worked with Robert on training young horses. Julia taught music and occasionally performed. They had dinner with Margaret and Daniel and little Julia most evenings, watching their granddaughter grow. More grandchildren followed. Margaret and Daniel had 2 more children, boys named Samuel and David. Thomas and Catherine had twins, a boy and girl. The ranch filled with young voices and laughter, and the big house that had once seemed too empty now bustled with life during holiday gatherings. In 1912, on their 33rd wedding anniversary, Samuel and Julia hosted a concert celebrating their life together. All their children came home with their families. Friends from across the state attended. Julia performed songs from every phase of her life. Songs from her days in Chicago, songs from those early desperate days at the Saloon, songs she'd written about falling in love with Samuel, songs about motherhood and the ranch and the passage of time. Samuel stood beside her for the final song, holding her hand, and together they sang a hymn his mother had taught him and Julia had arranged. Their voices, aged but still strong, blended together as naturally as breathing. After the performance, as guests mingled and children ran around the yard, Julia and Samuel slipped away to their favorite spot on the hill overlooking the ranch. The sun was setting, painting everything gold. 33 years, Samuel said. Feels like yesterday and forever at the same time. I know exactly what you mean, Julia said. Sometimes I still see that young cowboy who walked into the back room of a saloon with a crazy idea about building a stage on his porch. And I still see the beautiful, frightened singer who took a chance on that crazy idea. He pulled her close. Best risk either of us ever took. They stood together as darkness fell, watching stars emerge one by one. Below them, the ranch glowed with lamplight and echoed with laughter. This land had witnessed their courtship, their marriage, the birth of their children and grandchildren. It held their history in every fence post and building, in the stage that still stood on the porch, weathered but sturdy. I love you, Julia said. Then, now, always. Always, Samuel echoed, and kissed her as the first star appeared over the mountains. The years that followed were gentle ones. They watched their grandchildren grow, taught them songs and ranching skills, shared the wisdom of their years. Samuel's health remained strong into his 60s, though he moved more slowly. Julia's voice finally began to truly age in her late 50s, but she continued teaching long after she stopped performing publicly. In 1920, they celebrated their 41st anniversary quietly, just the 2 of them on the porch where it all began. They were both in their 60s now, hair completely silver, faces mapped with the lines of a life fully lived. No regrets? Samuel asked. Not a single one, Julia said firmly. I'd do it all again exactly the same way, every choice, every moment, if it meant ending up here with you. Same, Samuel said. Though I might have kissed you sooner, she laughed, the sound still bright and musical. You kissed me exactly when we were both ready. Everything happened in its own perfect time. They sat together until the stars came out, comfortable in the silence that only decades of love can create. Around them, the ranch continued its eternal rhythms. Cattle lowing in distant pastures, horses moving in the paddocks, the wind through the grass singing its endless song. Margaret and Daniel had taken over the ranch completely now, running it with skill and innovation. Thomas and Catherine were celebrated musicians, performing across the country but always returning home. Robert had built a successful business promoting concerts and cultural events across the West, using the model of community-based performances that his mother had pioneered. The grandchildren were finding their own ways. Young Julia, now 18, had her grandmother's voice and was studying music in Denver. Samuel Jr., 16, was training to take over the ranch from his parents eventually. David, 14, wanted to be a veterinarian. Thomas's twins were showing talent in music and art. The family tree had branched and flourished, rooted in the love that Julia and Samuel had planted all those years ago. As they entered their 70s, Samuel and Julia slowed further but remained engaged with life. They spent long mornings on the porch, afternoons visiting with family, evenings reading or listening to music. They took short walks around the property, revisiting the places of their courtship. The creek, the paddock where he'd taught her to ride, the spot where he'd proposed. One autumn evening in 1925, 46 years after they'd met, Samuel and Julia sat on the porch watching the sunset. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the mountains were already dusted with snow. "It's been a good life," Samuel said quietly. "Better than good." "It's been extraordinary." "It has," Julia agreed. "We've been so lucky, Samuel, lucky to find each other, lucky to build this life, lucky to watch our children and grandchildren thrive." "Not luck," Samuel said. "Love and hard work and trust. We built this together, Julia, every bit of it." She leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders, and they watched the day end in a blaze of color. Below them, the ranch was preparing for evening. Lights coming on in the main house where Margaret and Daniel lived with their youngest son, in the bunkhouse where the ranch hands were finishing their day, in the cottage where Mrs. Chen, now 90, still lived independently. "When I'm gone," Samuel said, and Julia started to protest, but he continued gently, "When I'm gone, I want you to keep singing. Don't stop making music just because I'm not here to listen." "Samuel, promise me," he said. "You brought music to this land, to this community. That's your legacy as much as our children. Promise me you'll keep sharing that gift." "I promise," Julia said through tears. "But you're not going anywhere for a long time yet." He smiled and kissed her forehead. "I hope you're right." They had several more good years together. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1929 with a massive gathering at the ranch. Children and grandchildren came from across the country. Friends and neighbors filled the property. Julia, now 72, sang one final public performance, her voice frail but still carrying unmistakable beauty. Samuel, 76, stood beside her, his hand in hers, and together they thanked everyone for sharing their lives. Samuel passed peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1930, 3 months before his 77th birthday. Julia woke one morning to find him gone, his face peaceful, his hand still holding hers. The grief was crushing, but it was softened by gratitude for the 51 years they'd had together, for the life they'd built, for the love that had sustained them through everything. The funeral filled the ranch with people whose lives had been touched by Samuel's kindness and integrity. Julia sat surrounded by her children and grandchildren, supported by their love as she'd supported them countless times. They buried him on the hill overlooking the ranch, the spot where he and Julia had stood so many times watching sunsets together. Julia lived another 8 years, remaining at the ranch, surrounded by family. True to her promise, she continued teaching music until her final year. Young singers still sought her out, wanting to learn from the legendary Julia Foster who'd brought music to the Wyoming frontier. She spent her days on the porch Samuel had built, often sitting in the spot where she'd performed for so many years. Sometimes, she'd sing quietly to herself, love songs that now carried the weight of memory and loss. But they also carried joy, because she'd been blessed to know what real love felt like, to build a life of meaning and purpose. Her children visited frequently, and the grandchildren came whenever they could. Great-grandchildren began arriving, and Julia would hold them and tell them stories about their great-grandfather, about the ranch's history, about the importance of love and hard work and treating people with respect. Julia passed quietly in her sleep in October 1938, 3 weeks after her 81st birthday. Her children were with her, holding her hands and singing the songs she'd taught them. Her last words were about Samuel, about how she'd see him soon, about how much she'd missed him. They buried her next to Samuel on the hill. The headstones were simple. Samuel Foster, 1853–1930, beloved husband, father, friend, and Julia Foster, 1857–1938, beloved wife, mother, singer of songs. Between the stones, the family planted roses that bloomed every summer, bright and beautiful against the Wyoming sky. The ranch continued under Margaret and Daniel's management, then passed to their son Samuel Jr. and his wife. The Foster family remained stewards of the land for generations, and every descendant knew the story of how it all began. With a cowboy who heard a woman singing in a saloon and offered her a stage on his porch instead. The porch itself became a historical landmark, preserved carefully through the decades. On summer evenings, family gatherings would end with someone singing on that stage, continuing the tradition Julia had started. The benches Samuel built had long since been replaced, but the stage remained, weathered and sturdy, a testament to the love that had built it. In the family collection, carefully preserved, was the original contract Samuel and Julia had signed, the simple agreement that had changed both their lives. Their letters to each other during his occasional trips away from the ranch were kept safe, filled with expressions of love and everyday details of ranch life. Julia's original song compositions were archived, and several had become standards sung across the West. The music room in the house still held Julia's piano, kept in tune and played regularly by various descendants who'd inherited her musical talent. Photographs lined the walls, Julia young and beautiful in her performance gowns, Samuel proud and weathered in his working clothes, the two of them together at various stages of their life, always touching, always connected. But the real legacy wasn't in objects or buildings. It was in the values they'd instilled: hard work, integrity, kindness to strangers, the importance of community, the power of love to transform lives. It was in the way Foster descendants treated their workers fairly, welcomed immigrants and outsiders, supported the arts and education in their community. It was in the understanding that sometimes the best things in life come from unexpected offers, from taking risks on people who seem genuine, from building something together rather than alone. Samuel had offered Julia a stage on his porch, but what he'd really offered was partnership, respect, and love. What they'd built together was so much more than a performing venue or a successful ranch. They'd built a family, a legacy, and a love story that endured long after they were gone. Years after both had passed, people still talked about Julia Freeman Foster and Samuel Foster, about the music that had filled the Wyoming air, about the love that had transformed a lonely ranch into a home filled with joy. Children grew up hearing the story, and it became part of the local folklore. The singer and the cowboy, the stage on the porch, the life built from trust and love and hard work. The land itself seemed to remember them. In the evenings, when the wind blew just right across the porch, people swore they could hear music, faint and sweet. And on the hill where they were buried, the roses bloomed faithfully every summer, bright and beautiful, like love made visible. Their story became a reminder that love could be found in the most unexpected places, that generosity could change lives, that taking a chance on someone could lead to 50 years of happiness. It was a reminder that the best legacies weren't measured in money or land, but in the lives touched, the love shared, the beauty created. The stage on the porch stood for over a century, a monument to a simple offer that had changed everything. And every time someone stood on that stage to sing, they were continuing a tradition that Julia and Samuel had started, proving that music and love could endure, could transform, could make even a harsh land feel like home. Their great-great-grandchildren would stand on that hill sometimes, looking out over the ranch, and feel the presence of those who'd come before, the love that had started it all. They'd think about the courage it took for Julia to trust a stranger, the kindness it took for Samuel to offer help without expecting anything in return, and the commitment it took for both of them to build a life together through challenges and triumphs. And they'd understand that this was what love looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements, but consistent choice, day after day, to honor and cherish and support each other. It was building stages and raising children and weathering storms together. It was aging side by side and holding hands through grief, and celebrating every joy as shared triumph. The sun would set over the mountains, painting everything gold, just as it had the night Samuel first told Julia he was falling in love with her. And in that light, the ranch would glow with the same warmth it had known for decades, a warmth that came not from the sun, but from the love that had been poured into every fence post and building, every acre of land, every note of music that had ever been sung there. This was the legacy of Julia Freeman Foster and Samuel Foster. Not just a successful ranch or a tradition of music, but proof that love could build something lasting, that kindness could change lives, that two people who took a chance on each other could create something beautiful that would endure for generations. And every summer evening, when the roses bloomed on their graves and the wind sang across the porch, that legacy lived on, as real and present as the mountains themselves, as enduring as the love that had created it.